pages 137 through 167 of the hard copy, pages 126 through 153 of the PDF. Snow. Had to check yesterday morning to make sure that was snow on the ground, not dust. But you can't make a dust ball packed together and slam against the side of the barn and echo across the fields. So I know it was snow. March 1935. Night school. My father thought maybe he ought to go to night school, so if the farm failed, there'd be prospects to fall back on. He's starting to sound like Ma. The farm won't fail, I tell him. Long as we get some good rain. I'm starting to sound like him. It's mostly ladies in those classes, he says. They take bookkeeping and civics and something called business English. I can't imagine him taking any of those things. But maybe he doesn't care so much about the classes. Maybe he's thinking more about the company of ladies. I'll bet none of the ladies mind spending time with my father. He's still good looking, with his strong back, and his blondie red hair, and his high cheeks rugged with wind. I shouldn't mind either. It's dinner I don't have to come up with, 'cause the ladies bring chicken and biscuits for him. I'm glad to get out of cooking. Sometimes, with my hands, it's hard to keep the fire, wash the pans, hold the knife, and spread a little butter. But I do mind his spending time with all of those biddies. I turn my back on him as he goes, and settle myself in the parlor, and touch Ma's piano. My fingers leave sighs in the dust. March 1935. Dust ammonia. 2 Fridays ago, Pete Guyman drove in with a truck full of produce. He joked with Caleb Hardley, Mr. Hardley's son, while they unloaded eggs and cream down at the store. Pete Guyman teased Caleb Hardley about the Wildcats losing to Hooker. Caleb Hardley teased Pete Guyman about his wheezy truck sucking in dust. Last Friday, Pete Guyman took ill with dust pneumonia. Nobody knew how to keep that produce truck on the road. It sat filled with turkeys and heavy hens, waiting for delivery. It sat out in front of Pete's drafty shack and sits there still, the cream curdling, the apples going soft, because a couple of hours ago, Pete Guyman died. Mr. Hardley was already on the phone to a new produce supplier before evening. He had people in his store and no food to sell them. His boy Caleb slammed the basketball against the side of the house until Caleb's ma yelled for him to quit. And late that night, a truck rattled up to the store with colored springs, dozens of hens, filthy eggs, and a driver with no interest whatsoever in young Caleb Hardley or his precious Wildcats. March 1935. Dust storm. I never would have gone to see the show if I had known a storm like this would come. I didn't know when going in, but coming out, a darker night I'd never seen. I bumped into a box beside the palace door and scraped my shins, then tripped on something in my path, I don't know what, and walked into a phone pole, bruised my cheek. The first car that I met was sideways in the road. Bowed down, my eyes near shut, trying to keep the dust out, I saw the headlights just before I reached them. The driver called me over, and I felt my way, following his voice. He asked me how I kept the road. I feel it with my feet, I shouted over the roaring wind. I walk along the edge. 1 foot on the road, 1 on the shoulder. And desperate to get home, he straightened out his car and straddled tires on the road and off and slowly pulled away. I kept along. I know that there were others on the road. From time to time, I'd hear someone cry out. Their voices rose like ghosts on the howling wind. No one could see. I stopped at neighbors just to catch my breath, and made my way from town out to our farm. Everyone said to stay, but I guessed my father would come out to find me if I didn't show, and get himself lost in the raging dust and maybe die, and I didn't want that burden on my soul. Brown earth rained down from sky. I could not catch my breath, the way the dust pressed on my chest and it wouldn't stop. The dirt blew down so thick it scratched my eyes and stung my tender skin. It plugged my nose and filled inside my mouth. No matter how hard I pressed my lips together, the dust made muddy tracks across my tongue. But I kept on, spitting out mud, covering my mouth, clamping my nose, the dust stinging the raw and open stripes of scarring on my hands. And after some 3 hours, I made it home. Inside, I found my father's note that said he'd gone to find me, and if I should get home, to just stay put. I hollered out the front door and the back. He didn't hear. I didn't think he would. The wind took my voice and busted it into 1,000 pieces. So small, the sound blew out over Ma and Franklin's grave, thinner than a sigh. I waited for my father through the night, coughing up dust, cleaning dust out of my ears, rinsing my mouth, blowing mud out of my nose. and Joe De La Flor stopped by around 4 to tell me they'd found one boy tangled in a barbed wire fence, another smothered in a drift of dust. After Joe left, I thought of the famous Lindberghs, and how their baby was killed and never came back to them. I wondered if my father would come back. He blew in around 6 a.m. It hurt the sight of him, brown with dirt, his eyes as red as raw meat, and his feet bruised from walking in worn shoes, stepping where he couldn't see, on things that bit and cut into his flesh. I tried to scare up something we could eat, but couldn't keep the table clear of dust. Everything I set down for our breakfast was covered before we took a bite, and so we chewed the grit and swallowed, and I thought of the cattle dead from the mud in their lungs, and I thought of the tractor buried up to the steering wheel, and Pete Guyman. I couldn't even recognize the man sitting across from me, sagging in his chair, his red hair gray and stiff with dust, his face deep lines of dust, his teeth streaked brown with dust. I turned the plates and glasses upside down, crawled into bed, and slept. March 1935. Broken promise. It rained a little everywhere but here. March 1935. Motherless. If Ma could put her arm across my shoulder sometime, or stroke back my hair, or sing me to sleep, making the soft sounds, the reassuring noises, and no matter how brittle and sharp life seemed, no matter how brittle and sharp she seemed, she was still my Ma who loved me, then I think I wouldn't be so eager to go. March 1935. Following in his steps. Hayden Parley Nye's wife Fonda died today, 2 months after she lost her man. The cause of death was dust pneumonia, but I think she couldn't go on without Hayden. When Ma died, I didn't want to go on either. I don't know. I don't feel the same now, not exactly. Now that I see that the other day comes after another and you get through them one measure at a time. But I like to go, not like Fonda Nye. I don't want to die. I just want to go, away, out of the dust. March 1935. Spring 1935. Heartsick. The hard part is, in spite of everything, if I had any boy court me, it'd be Mad Dog Craddock. But Mad Dog can have any girl. Why would he want me? I'm so restless. My father asks what's going on with me. I storm up to my room, leaving him alone, standing in the kitchen. If Ma was here, she would come up and listen, and then later she would curl beside my father and assure him that everything was all right, and soothe him into his farmer's sleep. My father and I, we can't soothe each other. I'm too young, he's too old, and we don't know how to talk anymore, if we ever did. April 1935. Skin. My father has a raised spot on the side of his nose that never was there before and won't go away. And there's another on his cheek, the 2 more on his neck, and I wonder why the heck is he fooling around? He knows what it is. His father had those spots too. April 1935. Regrets. I never go by Arlie's anymore. Still, every week he comes to school to teach, and sometimes I bump into Vera or Miller Rice or Mad Dog. They are always kind. They ask after my father. They ask how my hands are feeling. I cross my arms in front of me tight so my scars won't show. These days Mad Dog looks at me, halfway between picking a fight and kindness. He walks with me away some afternoons, never says a word. He's quiet once the other girls go off. I've had enough of quiet men. I ought to keep clear of Mad Dog, but I don't. April 1935. Fire on the rails. I hate fire. Hate it. But the entire Oklahoma panhandle is so dry, everything is going up in flames. Everything too ready to ignite. Last week the school caught fire. Damage was light on account of it being caught early. Most kids joked about it next day, but it terrified me. I could hardly go back in the building. And this week 3 boxcars in the train yard burned to ash. Jim Gowen and Harry Kelser spotted the fire. That was a miracle considering the fierceness of the dust storm at the time. The fire boys tore over, but they couldn't put the blaze out without water, and water is exactly what they didn't have. So they separated the burning cars and moved them down a siding, away from anything that might catch if the flames hot. It was all they talked about at school. The dust blew, they say, so if you think it would have smothered the fire out, but the flames, crazy in the wind, licked away at the wooden frames of the 3 boxcars, until nothing remained but warped metal and twisted rails, scorched dirt and charred tires. charred ties. No one talks about fire, right to my face. They can't forget how fire changed my life. But I hear them talking anyway. April 1935. The main train. They promised through rain, heat, snow, and gloom, but they never said anything about dust, and so the mail got stuck for hours, for days, on the Santa Fe, because mountains of dust had blown over the tracks, because blizzards of dust blocked the way. And all that time, as the dust beat down on the cars, a letter was waiting inside a mailbag. A letter from Aunt Ellis, my father's sister, written just to me, inviting me to live with her in Lubbock. I want to get out of here, but not to Aunt Ellis, and not to Lubbock, Texas. My father didn't say much when I asked what I should do. Let's wait and see, he said. What's that supposed to mean? April 1935. Migrants. We'll be back when the rain comes, they say, pulling away with all they own, straining the springs of their motor cars. Don't forget us, and so they go, fleeing the blowing dust, fleeing the fields of brown-tipped wheat, barley ankle-high, and sparse as the hair of a dog's belly. We'll be back, they say, pulling away toward Texas, Arkansas, where they can rent a farm, pull in enough cash, maybe start again. We'll be back when it rains, they say, setting out with their bed springs and mattresses, their cook stoves and dishes, their kitchen tables and their milk goats tied to their running boards in rickety cages, setting out for California, where even though they say they'll come back, they just might stay, if what they hear about that place is true. Don't forget us, they say, but there are so many leaving. How can I remember them all? April 1935. Blankets of black. On the first clear day, we staggered out of our caves of dust into the sunlight, turning our faces to the big blue sky. On the second clear day, we believed the worst was over at last. We flocked outside, traded in town, going to stores and coming out, only to find the air still clear and gentle, grateful for each easy breath. On the third clear day, summer came in April, and the churches opened their arms to all comers, and all comers came. After church, folks headed for picnics, car trips. No one could stay inside. My father and I argued about the funeral of Grandma Lucas, who truly was no relation, but we ended up going anyway, driving down the road in the procession to Texoma. 6 miles out of town, the air turned cold. Birds beat their wings. Everywhere you looked, whole flocks dropping out of the sky, crowding on fence posts. I was sulking in the truck beside my father when heaven's shadow crept across the plains, a black cloud, big and silent as Montana, boiling on the horizon and barreling toward us. More birds tumbled from the sky, frantically keeping ahead of the dust. We watched as the storm swallowed the light. The sky turned from blue to black night descending in an instant, and the dust was on us. The wind screamed. The blowing dirt ran so thick I couldn't see the brim of my hat as we plunged from the truck fleeing. The dust swarmed like it had never swarmed before. My father groped for my hand, pulled me away from the truck. We ran, a blind pitching toward the shelter of a small house, almost invisible, our hands tied together, running toward the ghostly door, pounding on it with desperation. A woman opened her home to us, all of us, not just me and my father, but the entire funeral procession. And one after another we tumbled inside, gasping, our lungs burning for want of air. All of the lamps were lit against the dark. The house, dazed by dust, gazed weakly out. The walls shook in the glowing wind. We helped tack up sheets in the windows and the doors to keep the dust down. Cars and trucks, unable to go on, their ignitions shorted out by the static electricity, opened up and let out more passengers. We stumbled for shelter. One family came in, clutched together, their paw divining the path with a long wooden rod. If it hadn't been for the company, this storm would have broken us completely, broken us more thoroughly than the plow had broken the Oklahoma sod, more thoroughly than my burns had broken the ease of my hands. But for the sake of the crowd and the hospitality of the home that sheltered us, we held on and waited, sitting or standing, breathing through wet cloths as the fog of dust filled the room and settled slowly over us. When it let up a bit, some went out to bury Grandma Lucas, but my father and I, we cleaned the thick layer of grime off the truck, pulled out of the procession, and headed on home, creeping slowly along the dust-mounded road. When we got back, we found the barn half covered in dunes. I couldn't tell which rise of dust was Ma and Franklin's grave. The front door hung open, blown in by the wind. Dust lay 2 feet in ripply waves across the parlor floor. Dust blanketed the cook stove, the icebox, the kitchen chairs, everything deep in dust, and the piano buried in dust. While I started to shovel, my father went out to the barn. He came back when I asked. He said the animals weren't good, and the tractor was dusted out. And I said, "It's a wonder the trucks got us home." I should have held my tongue. When he said, when he tried starting the truck again, it wouldn't turn over. April 1935.